To be honest, I'm going to get plenty of criticism over my lifetime, and it's something that I don't completely ignore.
The hushed courtroom fell silent as the judge's voice cut through the tension, reading words never meant for public consumption. Harry's composure shattered in an instant, his face draining of color as Meghan's most private thoughts echoed off the marble walls. What was revealed in those messages would change everything we thought we knew about the Sussex saga. The courtroom bombshell. The scene inside London's High Court on that crisp January morning was unlike anything royal watchers had witnessed in decades. Prince Harry sat rigid in the witness box, his knuckles white as he gripped the wooden rail before him. What had begun as a routine privacy lawsuit against a major British tabloid had suddenly taken a devastating turn that nobody, least of all Harry himself, could have anticipated. Judge Margaret Thornbury adjusted her reading glasses and cleared her throat, her expression grave as she prepared to address the court. The defense counsel had submitted what they claimed was critical evidence, messages obtained through legal discovery that they argued went to the heart of the case. Harry's legal team had fought desperately to keep these communications sealed, filing emergency motions and citing unprecedented privacy concerns. But the judge had ruled that morning that the public interest outweighed the privacy claims, and the messages would be read into the official court record. As the judge began to read, the first few lines seemed innocuous enough. Meghan discusses daily routines, frustrations with media coverage, plans for their children's education. But then the tone shifted dramatically. The messages revealed a side of the Duchess that contradicted years of carefully crafted public statements. There were calculated discussions about media strategy, deliberate plans to time certain announcements for maximum impact, and most damaging of all, dismissive comments about members of the royal family that went far beyond the revelations already made public in interviews and the couple's Netflix series. Harry's reaction was immediate and visceral. Those who were present in the courtroom that day described how his face seemed to crumble, the carefully maintained composure of a man who had spent his entire life in the public eye finally breaking under the weight of what was being exposed. His hands began to tremble visibly. A court sketch artist later revealed that she had to stop drawing because Harry's expression of anguish was too painful to capture. The messages kept coming, each one seemingly more damaging than the last. References to playing the long game regarding public sympathy. Discussions about which family members could be useful and which were obstacles to their independence. Strategic conversations about timing their departure from royal duties to coincide with maximum media attention. Every word read aloud contradicted the narrative of spontaneous decisions made under duress that the couple had presented to the world. Security personnel moved closer as Harry's distress became more apparent, concerned he might need medical attention. His lead attorney requested a brief recess, but the judge denied the motion, stating that the evidence presentation must continue uninterrupted. The public gallery, packed with journalists and royal observers, sat in stunned silence, many frantically typing notes on their phones despite the official prohibition on electronic devices. The messages that changed everything. The specific content of Meghan's messages painted a picture that royal commentators would spend weeks dissecting. Written over a period spanning from late 2022 through mid-2024, they represented a private correspondence primarily between Meghan and a close friend based in California, someone she had known since her acting days and trusted implicitly. What Meghan had not known was that this friend had been cooperating with the tabloid's legal team, providing access to their message history in exchange for undisclosed compensation and legal protection. The first category of damaging revelations centered on the couple's financial arrangements and their dealings with various media companies. Messages showed Meghan discussing specific dollar figures for potential deals, weighing the pros and cons of different partnerships based not on personal values but on optics management and brand positioning. One particularly striking exchange revealed her calculating exactly how long they needed to maintain certain public stances before pivoting to more commercially lucrative positions without appearing hypocritical. She had written extensively about their Netflix contract, describing it as our pension plan, and discussing how they could stretch the royal content across multiple projects to maximize the payout. There were candid assessments of which royal family stories would generate the most public interest and therefore the most value. One message coldly noted that anything involving Catherine sells, and discussed how they might leverage that dynamic without crossing legal lines regarding defamation. The second category cut even deeper, touching on personal relationships within the royal family. Meghan's private descriptions of various family members bore little resemblance to the measured criticisms offered in public interviews. Prince William was referred to in derogatory terms that cannot be repeated in polite company. Catherine was described with a level of vitriol that shocked even seasoned royal reporters who thought they had heard it all. But perhaps most painful for Harry were the messages about his own father, now King Charles, which revealed a level of manipulation and strategic thinking about their relationship that seemed to reduce family bonds to mere tactical considerations. The third category revealed extensive coaching and scripting of what had been presented as Harry's authentic, spontaneous thoughts and feelings. Messages showed Meghan drafting specific phrases for Harry to use in interviews, workshopping emotional beats for maximum impact, and even practicing certain vulnerable moments to ensure they would photograph well. Make sure he tears up when discussing Diana, one message read, discussing preparation for a major television interview. The catching of emotion mid-sentence thing works every time. There were detailed discussions about Harry's therapy sessions and how information from these could be deployed strategically in public statements. Meghan had apparently kept notes on Harry's most painful memories and traumas, cataloging them by their potential media value. One particularly chilling message discussed waiting for the right moment to reveal certain details about Harry's mental health struggles, timing the disclosure to coincide with a product launch or media event that needed additional publicity. The judge's voice had grown quieter as she read these passages, the weight of the revelations seeming to affect even her professional detachment. In the witness box, Harry had slumped forward, his elbows on his knees and his head in his hands. Those seated closest to him reported hearing muffled sounds that might have been sobs. His security detail stood nearby, uncertain whether to intervene or maintain their professional distance. What made these revelations particularly devastating was not merely their content but their implications. They suggested a level of calculation and manipulation that transformed the entire Sussex narrative from a tragic love story about a couple fighting against institutional prejudice into something far more cynical. Every tear shed in televised interviews, every heartfelt statement about family pain, every claim of authentic truth-telling now had to be re-examined through the lens of these strategic communications. The defense attorneys sat with carefully neutral expressions, knowing they had delivered a knockout blow to Harry's case. The privacy lawsuit, which had been about unauthorized publication of personal details, now seemed almost trivial to what was being voluntarily entered into public record through proper legal channels. Harry's team looked devastated, shuffling papers with shaking hands and passing notes with increasing desperation. Behind palace walls, to understand how the situation had deteriorated to this point requires looking back at the years of escalating tensions between the Sussexes and both the royal family and the British media establishment. What had begun as a fairy tale romance between a prince and an American actress had gradually transformed into a bitter, public conflict that had already cost both sides dearly. But this courtroom revelation represented a new nadir, a point from which recovery seemed impossible. The relationship between Harry and Meghan had always been intense and rapid. They met in the summer of 2016, became engaged by late 2017, and married in a globally televised ceremony in May of 2018. From the beginning, there had been tensions with the media, some of it undoubtedly rooted in racism and unfair treatment, some of it the inevitable scrutiny that comes with marrying into the most famous family in the world. Meghan had struggled with the transition from Hollywood actress to royal duchess, finding the restrictions and protocols stifling in ways she had apparently not fully anticipated. According to sources within the palace, there had been early warning signs that palace staff had tried to address diplomatically, Meghan's approach to royal duties was described as more transactional than traditional, with questions about the value proposition of various engagements and a reluctance to participate in events that did not align with her personal brand interests. These concerns had been raised gently, with senior courtiers trying to explain the peculiar nature of royal service and its sometimes seemingly archaic requirements. But the messages read in court suggested these early conflicts had been deliberately amplified rather than resolved. Meghan had written to her friend about collecting evidence of mistreatment, documenting incidents and interactions with an eye toward their eventual public use. She had described feeling trapped by the institution but also discussed strategic ways to build the case for their eventual departure. This suggested a level of premeditation that contradicted the narrative of a desperate, spontaneous escape from unbearable circumstances. The decision to step back from royal duties, announced in January of 2020, had been presented as a painful but necessary choice made under extreme duress. The couple had described feeling unsupported and unprotected by the institution, driven to desperate measures by their treatment. But the messages revealed extensive planning and strategizing that had begun months earlier, including consultations with American PR firms and detailed financial modeling of their post-royal earning potential. One particularly revealing exchange discussed the timing of their announcement, which famously blindsided the Queen and senior royals. Meghan had written about the advantages of announcing unilaterally rather than negotiating, describing how the shock value would generate more sympathetic media coverage and put the palace on the defensive. The message concluded with a laughing emoji and the words, "They will never see it coming." This calculated approach to what had been presented as an anguished decision painted their departure in an entirely new light. The subsequent years in California had been marked by a series of high-profile media projects, each offering new revelations about royal life and family conflicts. The Oprah interview in 2021 had included explosive allegations about racism within the family and lack of institutional support for Meghan's mental health struggles. Their Netflix documentary series had gone even deeper, with Harry discussing his childhood traumas and the couple presenting themselves as victims of a dysfunctional, sometimes cruel system. But the messages now being read in court showed extensive preparation and scripting for these appearances. Meghan had discussed with her friend which allegations would generate the most sympathy, which family members could be criticized without legal repercussions, and how to frame their story to maximize both public support and commercial opportunities. The Oprah interview, presented as a cathartic unburdening of long-held pain, had apparently been workshopped extensively, with specific claims calibrated for impact. Within the palace, reaction to these revelations was carefully controlled but deeply felt. King Charles had reportedly been informed of the messages before they were read in court, given time to prepare for the inevitable media storm. She offered only a terse response. "The institution must function with clarity. That has always been my position." Her lack of sentimentality drew both admiration and criticism. Some praised her for prioritizing duty over emotion. Sources close to the king described him as profoundly saddened but not entirely surprised, having long suspected that the public attacks contained elements of exaggeration or strategic positioning. Prince William's reaction was said to be one of vindication mixed with continued anger, feeling that his warnings about Meghan's character had been proven correct in the most public way possible. Catherine, the Princess of Wales, who had been particularly targeted in some of the revealed messages, maintained her characteristic public silence, but was described by friends as hurt and bewildered by the level of animosity directed at her in private communications. The messages had included speculation about Catherine's mental state, her marriage, and her capabilities as a mother, all presented with a casual cruelty that seemed designed to diminish and demean. The broader implications for the monarchy were significant and still unfolding. The institution had weathered many storms over the centuries, but the modern media environment made every crisis more intense and more difficult to manage. The revelations about Meghan's strategic communications raised questions about everything the Sussexes had said publicly over the past several years. How genuine? How much had been calculated for effect? Could any of it still be trusted? The unraveling. As the judge continued reading through the extensive message history, Harry's visible distress became the story within the story. Court observers noted that he seemed to age years in the span of hours, his face taking on a haggard, hollow appearance that photographs would capture and disseminate around the world within minutes. The proud, defiant prince who had entered the courtroom that morning had been replaced by a broken man, confronting the possibility that his entire life over the past several years had been built on manipulation and calculation. The most personally devastating messages came near the end of the evidence presentation. These were exchanges where Meghan discussed Harry himself with a frankness that was breathtaking in its coldness. She had described him as useful but difficult, someone whose royal status and family trauma provided incredible assets, but whose emotional needs were exhausting and required constant management. She had written about his therapy sessions in strategic terms, discussing which revelations could be saved for future projects and which were too personal or legally risky to deploy. In one particularly brutal passage, Meghan had written about Harry's love for his family despite everything, describing it as both touching and pathetic, and something that needed to be carefully controlled so it did not interfere with their plans. She had discussed his occasional expressions of doubt about their chosen path, his moments of homesickness and regret, as problems to be solved rather than feelings to be honored and explored. The clinical, almost contemptuous tone of these assessments suggested a relationship dynamic far different from the supportive, loving partnership presented to the world. There were also messages about their children, Archie and Lilibet, that raised uncomfortable questions about parenting decisions and motivations. Discussions about how much to share publicly about the children, when to release photographs, whether to bring them to the UK for family events, all seemed to be calibrated based on media impact and public relations value rather than the children's well-being or privacy. One message discussed using Lilibet's first birthday, which happened to coincide with the late Queen's Platinum Jubilee celebrations, to remind everyone we exist and generate sympathetic coverage during a family event that was not about them. The revelation about the children seemed to be what finally broke Harry completely. According to multiple witnesses, he began to cry openly in the witness box, his shoulders shaking with sobs that could be heard throughout the courtroom. His lead attorney again requested a recess, this time more forcefully, arguing that his client was in no condition to continue. The judge, perhaps moved by the obvious distress, agreed to a 30-minute break, and Harry was escorted from the courtroom by his security team, shielding him from the cameras that had gathered outside. During the recess, frantic consultations took place in the corridor outside. Harry's legal team faced a devastating situation. The privacy case they had brought was now irrelevant compared to the damage being done by legally obtained evidence. She had spent years rebuilding her reputation, transforming from a polarizing figure into a respected queen consort, environmental advocacy, and quiet dignity. Instead, he found himself navigating family fractures, health uncertainties, and decisions that left scars no public statement could heal. The idea of being relegated to ceremonial duties felt, to her, they discussed options for damage control, possible settlement offers, ways to spin the revelations. But the simple truth was inescapable. The messages spoke for themselves, and no amount of legal maneuvering could erase what had been said. Harry himself was reportedly inconsolable during the break, alternating between tears and stunned silence. Those who spoke with him described a man in shock, unable to process the full implications of what was being revealed. He had apparently known that some personal messages might be disclosed as part of the legal process, but had not anticipated the breadth or the content of what the defense had obtained. The realization that his wife had been discussing him, their relationship, and their children in such calculating terms, while presenting a completely different face to him personally, was clearly devastating. When court resumed, Harry looked even worse than before. His eyes were red and swollen, his face blotchy from crying. The judge asked if he was capable of continuing, and he nodded silently, seeming to have lost the capacity for speech. What followed was perhaps even more damaging. Messages from more recent months, written after the couple's various media projects had been released, and the full extent of their public campaign against the royal family had become clear. These later messages showed Meghan discussing the next phases of their media strategy, including a potential memoir from her perspective and additional documentary content. She had written about mining their remaining royal stories for maximum commercial value, discussing which secrets could still be revealed and how to time these revelations for optimal impact. There was a chilling quality to the way she inventoried their remaining assets, including Harry's relationships with cousins and old friends who had not yet been publicly discussed. Most disturbing were messages suggesting she was already planning for various contingencies, including the possibility that Harry might eventually want to reconcile with his family or return to the UK. She had written about maintaining insurance in the form of saved stories and revelations that could be deployed if needed to prevent such a reconciliation. The messages portrayed a relationship where Harry's authentic feelings and desires were seen as potential threats to be managed rather than valid perspectives to be respected. By the time the judge finished reading the evidence, over 4 hours had passed. The courtroom sat in heavy silence as she removed her glasses and set aside the documents. Harry remained slumped in the witness box, staring at nothing, his face a mask of devastation. The judge announced that the court would adjourn for the day and resume the following morning, but it was clear to everyone present that something fundamental had shifted. This was no longer just a legal proceeding. It was the public disintegration of a marriage and the complete collapse of a carefully constructed public narrative. Public reaction and royal fallout. The impact of the courtroom revelations rippled outward with unprecedented speed and force. Within minutes of the court adjourning, the first news alerts began hitting phones around the world. Social media exploded with reactions ranging from shock to vindication to schadenfreude. The hashtags related to the case trended globally within the hour, with millions of people weighing in on what the messages revealed and what they meant for the Sussex brand and the broader royal family. For many who had been skeptical of the Sussex narrative from the beginning, the messages felt like vindication. Royal commentators who had questioned certain aspects of Harry and Meghan's story, often facing accusations of racism or bias for doing so, pointed to the revelations as evidence that their concerns had been legitimate. The messages seemed to confirm suspicions that at least some of the couple's public claims had been exaggerated, strategically timed, or outright manufactured for effect. But there was also a significant contingent who felt deeply uncomfortable with the public exposure of private messages, regardless of their content. Privacy advocates argued that everyone, even public figures, deserved some sphere of private communication where they could speak freely without fear of public judgment. The method by which the messages had been obtained, through a friend's cooperation with a tabloid's legal team, struck many as a betrayal that said as much about the friend as it did about Meghan. Within the royal family, the response was carefully calibrated but unmistakable. Buckingham Palace released a brief statement expressing sadness at the situation and noting that some matters are best resolved privately within families. The restraint of the statement was interpreted by royal watchers as a sign of strength, a refusal to gloat or attack despite years of public criticism from the Sussexes. King Charles was said to remain open to eventual reconciliation with his son, though aides acknowledged that the revelations had complicated an already difficult situation. Prince William and Princess Catherine maintained their public schedule without comment, appearing at a previously planned engagement the day after the court session looking composed and professional. Those close to William suggested he felt a complex mixture of emotions: sadness for his brother, anger at how his family had been treated, concern about the long-term implications for both Harry personally and the institution of the monarchy. Catherine was described as having reached a point of emotional detachment from the Sussex drama, focusing instead on her own family and duties. The commercial implications were immediate and severe. Netflix reportedly held emergency meetings to discuss their ongoing relationship with the Sussexes, weighing the value of the royal connection against the reputational risk of being associated with what was increasingly being portrayed as a calculated manipulation of public sympathy. Several major brands that had partnerships or associations with Meghan quietly began distancing themselves, with publicists citing evolving business priorities and scheduling conflicts. Harry's memoir, Spare, which had been a massive commercial success upon its release, suddenly faced renewed scrutiny. Readers began revisiting passages in light of the revealed messages, questioning which parts represented Harry's authentic feelings and which might have been influenced or outright written by Meghan. The emotional power of the book, which had moved millions, now felt tainted by the possibility of manipulation and calculation, would formalize what was already happening informally. It would provide structure, eliminate ambiguity, and ensure the household functioned with clear leadership. But Charles knew the deeper truth. This was not simply about structure. This was about power, relevance. Public opinion polls showed dramatic shifts in both the UK and the United States. In Britain, where the Sussexes had already faced significant skepticism, the Foreign Office also weighed in, warning that the leak could complicate diplomatic relationships. International partners valued approval ratings plummeted even further, with some surveys showing support dropping into the single digits. More surprisingly, American public opinion, which had been largely sympathetic to the couple's narrative of escaping a racist and outdated institution, began to turn sharply. The messages revealed a level of calculation and cold manipulation that Americans, whatever their feelings about the monarchy, found distasteful and dishonest. The impact on Meghan personally was particularly severe. She had built a brand around authenticity, compassion, and speaking truth to power. The revealed messages undermined all of these claims, portraying someone who was calculating, sometimes cruel, and willing to manipulate both public opinion and her own husband for personal and commercial gain. Her existing projects and partnerships faced immediate backlash, with some corporate sponsors quietly ending their associations and others demanding contract renegotiations. For Harry, public reaction was more complex. Many expressed sympathy for a man who appeared to have been manipulated by someone he loved and trusted. The image of him breaking down in court generated genuine compassion, with people comparing his situation to other high-profile cases of emotional or psychological manipulation within relationships. But there was also frustration and anger directed at him for participating in the public attacks on his family and for the damage done to the monarchy's reputation through his cooperation with Meghan's various media projects. Mental health professionals weighed in on what the revelations might mean for Harry's psychological well-being. Several noted concerning signs in the court footage and photographs, warning about the risk of severe depression or other mental health crises when someone's entire understanding of their reality is suddenly upended. Calls for Harry to seek immediate support and potentially return to the UK to be near family were common in media commentary, though whether he would be willing or able to take such steps remained unclear. The legal case itself became almost secondary to the personal drama. Harry's attorneys filed motions to have certain messages excluded from the public record on privacy grounds, but the damage was already done. Discussions of settlement became more urgent, with both sides recognizing that continuing the case would only generate more damaging publicity. The tabloid that was being sued, having already achieved a spectacular public relations victory through the revelation of the messages, indicated openness to reasonable settlement terms. What happens next? For their marriage, the implications were potentially catastrophic. Harry now knew that his wife had been discussing him in dismissive, sometimes contemptuous terms while presenting a loving, supportive face to him personally. He knew that decisions he thought they had made together had been strategized and planned by Meghan with her friend, with his role being managed and directed rather than collaborative. He knew that his emotional vulnerabilities and family traumas had been cataloged and assessed for their commercial and public relations value rather than treated with the respect and care a loving partner should provide. Marriage counselors and relationship experts interviewed in the aftermath of the revelations were nearly unanimous in their assessment that recovery from such a betrayal would be extremely difficult, if not impossible. The foundation of trust necessary for a healthy relationship had been completely undermined. Even if Harry wanted to stay in the marriage for the sake of their children or out of his own emotional attachment, the knowledge of how he had been perceived and discussed would inevitably poison every interaction going forward. There were already reports emerging from sources close to the couple that Harry had moved out of their Montecito mansion, taking up temporary residence elsewhere while he processed what had been revealed. Meghan was said to be attempting to contact him constantly, offering explanations and apologies. Harry was reportedly not taking her calls. Friends of Harry described him as feeling utterly betrayed and questioning everything he thought he knew about the past several years of his life. The possibility of divorce, unthinkable just days earlier for a couple who had seemed united against the world, was now being openly discussed by royal commentators and legal experts. If Harry chose to end the marriage, the custody arrangements for Archie and Lilibet would become a major concern, particularly given that the children are in line for the throne, albeit distantly, and have titles within the British royal family. A custody battle between a member of the royal family and an American citizen living in California, but those who knew her well noticed the tension in her shoulders, the slight tightness around her eyes. She smiled for the cameras, engaged warmly with patients, would be legally complex, and potentially very public. For Meghan, the path forward was perhaps even more challenging. Her entire post-royal identity had been built on being a victim of institutional racism and cruelty, someone who had sacrificed everything for love and been rejected by a family unable to accept her. Her commercial prospects had been damaged severely, possibly irreparably. The companies and organizations that had been eager to associate with her when she represented a glamorous, principled stand against institutional prejudice were far less interested in being connected to someone portrayed as coldly manipulative and willing to exploit her husband's trauma for profit. Several pending deals were reportedly canceled or indefinitely postponed in the days following the courtroom revelations. For the royal family, the situation presented both challenges and opportunities. On one hand, the revelations vindicated their more restrained approach to the Sussex situation and seemed to justify their reluctance to engage publicly with various allegations. On the other hand, seeing a family member suffer so publicly was genuinely painful, particularly for King Charles, who despite everything remained Harry's father and wanted to see his son happy and healthy. There were quiet indications that if Harry wanted to return to the UK, either temporarily or permanently, he would be welcomed by his family. Not necessarily back into royal duties or his former position, but welcomed as a son and brother who had been through a terrible experience and needed support. Whether Harry would be willing or able to accept such support, given years of acrimony and the difficulty of admitting he might have been wrong about so much, remained to be seen. The broader implications for the monarchy as an institution were still being debated. Some argued that the Sussex saga demonstrated the need for modernization and reform, showing how the pressures and restrictions of royal life could drive people to desperate measures. Others contended that the revelations proved the wisdom of traditional royal approaches to privacy, discretion, and keeping personal matters out of the public eye. The truth, as usual, likely lay somewhere between these extremes. What remained certain was that January afternoon in the High Court had changed everything. The fairy tale had ended not with a happily ever after, but with a courtroom breakdown and the public exposure of private betrayals. Harry's tears, captured in photographs and video that would be replayed endlessly, represented more than personal pain. They symbolized the collapse of a narrative that millions had believed, the destruction of a relationship that had seemed to transcend boundaries and unite worlds. The coming weeks and months would bring more revelations, more legal maneuvering, more public speculation. Harry would have to decide what kind of life he wanted going forward, and whether that life included the woman he had sacrificed so much to be with. Meghan would have to confront the gap between the person she had presented to the world and the person revealed in those private messages. The royal family would have to navigate the complex dynamics of potentially welcoming back a prodigal son while maintaining the dignity and stability of the institution. But on that January day in court, as the judge's voice finally fell silent and Harry remained slumped and broken in the witness box, none of those future complications mattered. What mattered was the raw, immediate pain of a man discovering that the life he thought he was living had been something very different. That moment of realization, that visible shattering of composure and certainty, would define how this chapter of the royal story would be remembered. Not as a triumph or a tragedy in the classical sense, but as a very human moment of devastation played out on a very public stage. The revelations from that courtroom continue to reverberate through royal circles and beyond. As this story develops, we will keep you updated with every new detail and development. What do you think about these shocking revelations? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss an update on this unfolding royal drama. The truth, it seems, is far more complicated than anyone imagined.